Hello guys, it's Sidewinder again, and we're back with another episode of our American tank history lessons of World War II. So, today we're going to be going over the M3 medium tank, the M5 light tank, and the M22 light tank. So, let's start with the M3 medium, otherwise known as the Lee or the Grant. The M3 medium was a direct modification of the M2. The most notable changes were the addition of a 75mm gun in a right side sponson at the front of the vehicle, as well as an updated turret, now offset to the left side of the vehicle, to leave room for the 75mm. The tank was supplied with the Wright Continental R975 EC2 400 horsepower engine and a vertical volute spring suspension, or VVSS. The M3 medium could travel at a top speed of 26 miles per hour. The M3 medium had quite an arsenal of weaponry on board. The M3 was installed with a 75mm, a 37mm, as well as up to 4 .30 caliber machine guns. The M3 medium was operated by a crew of 7. So, the vehicle currently in the gameplay that I'm using is the M3 Lee. You can tell by its current turret. This one has a 7-man crew, while the British model has a 6-man crew. So, the whole reason with the different crew size is because the British, they put the radio in the turret for the commander to use, but this model of the tank had it down in the hull, so the commander couldn't use it. So that's why this turret's differently shaped and is a different size. The Americans also put an additional turret on top of the turret, which had another 30 caliber machine gun inside. So, the M3 Lee / Grants, whatever, it's the exact same tank. They were used by the United States, Great Britain, Russia, Australia. They're used by just about every country in the war, captured or otherwise, you know? So, they have a very large and pretty good service record, even though they weren't that good of a tank. So, the M3 came about because well, for one, the British lost all their tanks in Dunkirk, and they needed a new tank that had a 75mm gun, and also because the US Army realized just how underclassed the M2 medium was, because the M2 medium could not compare to the German Panzer 3s and 4s. It just couldn't. Its armament was way too low, its armor was bad, everything about it was pretty much bad, except for the suspension and drivetrain and the engine and the suspension and the lower part of the hull. All those were kept on the M3 medium tank. So, early models of the M3, their cannons weren't the best. I believe it was called the M2. Yeah, I believe it's the M2 75mm gun. And the shell that they had wasn't all that good. It was actually an artillery shell, not an anti-tank shell. So it had to hit a specific way. It had to hit like almost perfectly for the shell to even trigger the fuse and explode. So it was kind of bad, but they ended up fixing that by changing the cannon breech and with parts from a French cannon, and they ended up rechambering or reloading all the shells for the cannon with German 75mm shells. They just put it in a different casing, which is pretty interesting. But the M3 medium tanks, they actually performed quite well in the desert. Not so much everywhere else except for the Pacific, where the Japanese tanks were all light and actually obsolete compared to the M3 medium. So, in the Russian service, the Russians, they kind of had a love-hate relationship with it a little bit. They were given the one with the 7 crew, and I believe they called them the Grave of 7 Brothers, because they were knocked out a lot, because the main gun is positioned in a terrible spot. It's positioned down in the hull, to the right side of the hull, and can't traverse, like, hardly at all. So, that means that you have to turn the entire tank in order to use the main gun, which is a problem when you're fighting tanks, you know, because 37mm can go so far and do so much. But you'd much rather have a 75 over a 37. So the Russians, they used it and they accepted using it because they were given it, but they really didn't like it. So, next tank that we're going to be talking about is the M5 light tank, otherwise known as the M5 Stuart. The M5 light is simply a M3 light with a redesigned hull and a new but very similar turret. The M3 had the same vertical volute spring suspension, VVSS, and the same 37mm main gun, same 4-man crew, and the M5 was driven by 2 Cadillac V8 296 horsepower engines, which could propel the vehicle at top speed of 36 miles an hour. So these fought in North Africa. They actually fought in all theaters of war, but they were light tanks, so they were very susceptible to fire and couldn't dish out that much damage. As you see here, it's over very quickly for this little M3 or M5, I mean. Alright, so next tank we're going to talk about is the M20 Locus. The M20 Locus was a light tank designed by the Marmon Harrington Company to be light enough to be loaded into a glider and flown into battle with paratroopers. Locus was to provide much needed transportation, cover, and anti-tank support to the paratroopers. The M22 was produced from 1942 to 1945. The M22 resembled a very small, when I say very, I mean very small M4 Sherman, and was fitted with a 37mm gun and a coaxial 30 caliber machine gun. That's all the armament on the vehicle. The vehicle had a vertical volute spring suspension, or VVSS, and the M22 was powered by a Lycoming 0435T 6-cylinder boxer engine, which produced 165 horsepower. The M22 had a 3-man crew and was used primarily by the United States and Britain, and later by the Egyptians. The M22's armor was less than half an inch thick. The M22, however, had a top speed of 40 miles an hour, and that's actually extremely good for a tank of the time. The only problem is with this tank is, yes, the armor is absolutely terrible, but for what it was designed for, it was a decent tank. But by the time it actually went into service, which was during the D-Day invasions, they were so obsolete that they were next to useless anyway. But they are an interesting tank to look at, and that's for sure. So, like I said earlier, the Egyptians also used them. The Egyptians used them in fighting against Israel, I believe it was, with varying success. It's just a really small, light tank. But the suspension style was a VVSS, but it was the same type of VVSS as on the M3 and M5 light tanks, which is pretty interesting but pretty understandable for the vehicle, as they were just trying to use parts that they had on hand. That's why they modeled the turret and everything after the M4 Sherman, even though it was most definitely not a Sherman. So, the company that actually designed this was a bus company, and they made, well, obviously, they made buses and trolleys. The tank was actually designed by the United States by request from the British, because the British, they really were playing with the idea of bringing in glider-borne tanks and other vehicles to help the paratroopers. But the vehicle that they had in mind originally was a light tank that they already had in their arsenal called the Techarch. But the Techarch really wasn't that good of a vehicle, and it wasn't meant to be put into a lighter, or I said a lighter, I'm sorry, a glider. So they never actually ended up, they did use them, but not to the extent of what the British had in mind originally. So that's why the M20 Locus was designed, and around 800 of these were actually built, which is pretty interesting. I believe the majority of them were actually used by the British, but there were ones used by the Americans too. But for the vehicle size, it's actually quite a good vehicle, actually. But it really depends on the situation. Like, this is better for scouting. But anyway, we're reaching the end of the video, so I'd like to thank you guys for watching. Please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, tell me what you think of the video, any suggestions for the next one, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye!